Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of those that are attending this webinar today. My name is Joanna Yilmaz, and I'm moderating today's webinar on behalf of the Royal Aeronautical Society's Flight Crew Training Specialist Group. Because of the situation that we find ourselves in, we're transitioning to a more virtual event, and we're super grateful for the power of technology in enabling us to speak to you in this format today. Just before we started, I got the registration numbers from the Society, and we're overwhelmed by how many of you are able to join us today and take part, even though everyone's got such busy lives at the moment. And we're really looking forward to this being a very interactive and informal session. So 1 year into the pandemic, and I'm sure everybody is very familiar with online communication and technology. And this webinar will follow a similar format to others that you may have seen before. We have an excellent group of expert speakers today who will each give a short presentation before we open up the floor to any questions that you may have in the audience. So please feel free and be forthcoming with those. To enable you to ask questions, there is a chat box, and after the presenters have finished, I'll be posing those questions to them myself. So if you would like your question to be answered by a specific speaker, then please just make sure that you mention that in your question so we can direct them accordingly. So unless you're here by accident, following an unlikely series of mouse clicks, you'll all know what today is about. It's pilot competencies. So I'm not going to go on about the content too much, and we'll get to the action very quickly. To keep you on the edges of your home office chairs a little bit longer, I'll set the scene. So the Specialist Flight Crew Training Group aims to promote yet challenge best practice in training, and this event will be no different. As an industry, we are respected for our introspective approach and regulated procedures that exist to improve safety and quality standards. As aviators, it is in our nature to analyse the way that we do things and look to refine and improve things as we go on. It's therefore crucially important that we as an industry seek opportunities to engage with both internal and external experts to ensure that we are kept appraised of the latest thinking and the latest theories, and that we then filter those back into our flight crew training procedures. To that end, as we improve our knowledge, we must evolve our practices. Before we hear from our first speaker, I'm just going to take a short moment to update those that may be familiar with the International Flight Crew Training Conference that's usually held in September each year, with the exception of last year. I've recently taken over from the wonderful Peter Barrett as the chair of the conference, and we usually hold it at Hamilton Place in London, and we're currently exploring different options with our colleagues in the Society to make sure that we can go ahead with the event and get the maximum number of people to participate. So there's more to come on that, so please watch that space for any of you that are interested in attending that upcoming conference. So, to the good stuff. We have an excellent group of speakers today, and first up is Richard Nanton. With an aviation career spanning in excess of 30 years, Richard has been an examiner and instructor on the A320, A330 and 777. His career has seen him nominated post holder in the UK for both flight training operations and training. This has left Richard well placed to go through some of the observed changes in the flight training environment. So Richard, please can I welcome you up for the first presentation.
Thank you, Joe, and good afternoon, good evening, morning, everybody. I hope you're all well. My name is Richard Nanton, as Joe said, and I've been a TRI now for around 20 years, and I've been involved in the aviation industry for over 30. Second generation pilot, my father was a pilot, and as part and parcel of the reflection for undertaking this very quick presentation, one of the things I started to reflect on, particularly after discussing it with him, was what would be the defining area for my career? His career had seen him start flying in the late 50s and finishing in the 90s, where technology change on aircraft has been significant. I started flying in the late 80s, continue to fly today, and the aircraft I fly really aren't significantly different in terms of technology, but have added on value and increased capability, but not the fundamental changes that we saw between the 40s and 50s. And as a result of that, I got thinking, in terms of the defining part of my career, where would that stand? And it's probably going to be the fact that what he saw in technology change, I would probably have seen in training and training capability within the industry. And sort of moving on from that, if we look at just the technology change that occurred between the 1920s and 1980s, there was quite a significant increase in complexity with a decreasing direct pilot control. Once you get to the 1980s, and if you look at the capability of the aircraft from there to today, as I said, whilst there have been some add-on benefits and increased capability, there's really been no fundamental changes. We haven't seen something as fundamental as fly-by-wire coming in the late 80s. But what we've seen is a significant change in the way we actually train pilots, because the regulation and the starting point for the way we've trained pilots over years really developed out of the 30s and 40s, where aircraft unreliability, the more direct control by pilots over the actual aircraft meant that we had to train certain recurrent processes that needed to be understood. And those processes really revolved around two aspects. It was the stick and rudder skills, the capability of being able to fly the aircraft, and the basic skills, the knowledge, the ability to be able to technically understand both the aircraft rules and regulations. But at the time, flight deck management skills did not play as a significant a part as they do, particularly when you look to the aircraft we fly today. And obviously, flight deck management skills have become a more fundamental role in terms of being able to understand the aircraft, understand what it's doing, but also having the stick and rudder skills and the basic skills in the background. What we've basically seen, though, since the advent of the modern jet age, particularly towards the late 70s, was with the advent of CRM following the accidents and incidents that occurred, particularly major accidents such as Tenerife North, etc. We've seen CRM go through a number of different iterations, and the ability to be able to develop those softer skills, particularly around flight deck management. But at the time, we've also seen an evolution that at times has predicated people to move towards greater automation, which has meant stick and rudder skills and that capability in itself became diminished. And then we saw incidents and accidents developing in the late 2000s and early 2000 and teens, whereby those fundamental skills no longer presented themselves. And what we've seen up to date is that it's a capability of being able to move between these three fundamentals, being able to apply them at the right time, that really makes the pilot competent and capable of being able to undertake his role. And because of the advent of the CRM aspects and the fact that we've gone through a number of different iterations, it's worthwhile as part of the scene setting that I'm doing today prior to looking at the rest of the presentations, is understanding how we've got to where we've got to with the training capability today. Obviously, as we went through the 90s and early 2000s, the capability of non-technical skills and that development as part of a reiteration of CRM development, whether it be third, fourth, or fifth generation, required or recognized the fact that pilots needed these additional flight deck management capability, but made them into something that appeared to be standing outside of the normal pilot competency, i.e., it was not part of their technical capability to be able to operate the aircraft. And the development of the non-technical skills in themselves was seen to be a capability that was required, but not part of the assessment process. The technical skills and the stick and rudder skills that pilots had always been easily identified and easily assessed, because they did tend to be either black and white items in knowledge. It was a pass or fail, or it was a capability that was easily recognizable. You could take off or you could land an aircraft. The introduction of these types of skills now, which were seen as softer skills, into things like lofts and pilot training, meant that there was now a recognition that there was perhaps two tracks to this. One was the technical capability of pilots, which was seen as a competencies at the time for them to be able to do their job, plus an add-on. The events, obviously, of 2000 with Air France 447 and AirAsia 8501 obviously indicated that despite the need to have gone towards trying to drive an automated process, the competencies, particularly around the non-technical aspect, were far more fundamental than just saying that they were non-technical parts of a pilot's capability. And obviously, with the development of ITQI and the processes through ICAO, IATA, and agreeing with IFALPA, what we found were pilot competencies were developed. The pilot competencies now are behavioral traits that have been codified for pilots to be able to be assessed. However, what still happens is that probably the softer side of these competency skills, whilst being codified and being able to be identified as behaviors, still present probably the greatest challenge for assessments and assessment capability. The application of procedures, the capability of manipulating the aircraft, and knowledge are fundamentals that existed in the aviation industry from day one. The introduction of these new competencies does require a mindset change, though, and that mindset change in both the way instructors develop, instructors are taught to instruct, and also pilots are assessed, means that we now need to be able to find the actual, when you look at the learning capability, is to be able to understand the knowledge, skills, and attitudes of pilots, and particularly in the softer skills, is to be able to find the attitudes as a root cause analysis that poses the greatest sort of challenge to us as an industry. And that's where us as a flight crew training group are coming from, in terms of looking for new ways to be able to help people learn, develop, and also improve their capabilities and competencies as we move forward. That process has started. That process has started with the implementation of EBT, which now takes those competencies and puts them at the heart of their program, along with all of the other evidence that comes in from the organization. And that competency assessment is key. But also now what happens is, as part of this regulation update, is we see not only instructor training, but also instructor standardization to be able to ensure that the assessment and grading process is coherent and delivers the outcome that people want to see. But what we're at risk of doing is developing a two-track process whereby, because evidence-based training is voluntary, we're actually possibly leaving standard regulation with competencies attached to it, without the instructor training and instructor standardization of how to be able to develop that root cause analysis for when competencies are not graded or assessed as being in the ballpark that people would expect them to be. And how do we then move individuals based on a competency assessment from where they are to where they need to be? And the only way we can do that is part and parcel of having a change of approach, a paradigm shift as it's been explained with the introduction of evidence-based training, to the ways instructors train, assess, and also coach and allow people to develop. And the challenges we face with that is that as an industry, we still have a lot of the legacy from the 30s and 40s still present. We still have, even with the acronyms of instructor and examiner, acronyms that conjugate and bring up ideas that instruction is still a fundamental, when to be able to get people to change attitudes in particular requires a new way of looking at it, and particularly around coaching and development of individuals as whole rather than specific areas. And the challenges we face are around even the way we train, the environment within which we train. The simulators still represent two individuals that sit in front of an instructor, and that one individual has to try and make assessments now on 8 areas of competencies that are more often than not interacted with behaviors and outputs from 2 individuals in a dynamic environment. And if we only do that on a month by month or set training sort of event, which has always been the case in history of aviation, whereby we'd go in at set periods of time, we run the risk of not being able to develop true pathways for individuals and coach them to the areas that they need to be able to find themselves in, particularly in the softer side of what we're trying to do. To date, the first pathway as such was really come about with IATA, with stuff like the command training and guidance and material and best practices for that. But that is still only one pathway. That's still only one event. What about the individuals who've actually finished their command training and sit for 30 odd years and need to be able to change competencies and adapt, and also, find new ways of being able to work? And that's where we stand here today as part of this exercise. Are there other areas and are there other industries that can teach us more effective ways of working, that not only take the paradigm shift that we've seen with evidence-based training, but also now make an even greater paradigm shift in terms of the way we instruct? We get individuals to move from where they are to where they want to be, and also deliver the whole training program rather than what we've seen in the past. And that's what I'd like to hand over now to the rest of the presenters, because using that capability and understanding what other industries do is really the key for us as an industry to move forward in our own development and our own training practices.
Thank you very much, Richard. Great presentation there, very insightful. And yeah, that brings us very nicely to our next speaker for this session. We have Peter Mays joining us. Peter, for those that don't know him, is a fellow member of the Flight Crew Training Specialist Group, and he is a senior OD trainer. He's been involved in learning and development his whole adult life, and in the mid-2000s he studied the National Occupational Standard in the UK whilst devising a competency framework for learning and development practitioners. Over to you, Peter.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm delighted to be in this session and hearing what Richard has just said. There are elements in what I'm about to say which will echo and reinforce that. At the end of my session, I'm going to pose a question regarding the advances in learning and development sciences. But first, I'd like to put things into context. Learning and development as a profession with a small p suffers from a serious flaw. There is no barrier to entry. As a result, those who are deemed good at what they do or are required to by organizational policy have a tendency to end up in the training department with no knowledge of learning theory or practice, The result is a profession populated by sector-specific masters of their craft, but who are L&D novices. Whilst some who enter the L&D profession may routinely trot out what they have been told to, some others take a greater interest in the theory and practices within the sector, and it is those that will have seen some recent changes. In the past decade or so, learning and development theory and practice has started to move towards being more evidence-informed. Research within a variety of psychological, neuroscientific, and other fields has started to provide evidence that some of the ways that we used to do things in the past, whilst intuitively plausible, now have little or no empirical evidence to back them up. Furthermore, others, whilst originating from research, have been misquoted or misappropriated to support learning strategies, interventions, and tools, often peddled by somebody selling a solution. The assertion that we should train people to accommodate a self-declared learning style is a myth. Firstly, people tend not to be good at self-declaration, and evidence now points to the methodology having no impact. Indeed, it has been shown to impede learning. Who has heard of the statistics that body language accounts for 55% of communication, 38% being attributed to the tone of the language, and only 7% the words themselves? This is the Morabian myth, or more properly, the Morabian misconception. Other aspects within learning and development call on us to review the implementation of some of our favoured theories, methodologies, and tools, such as Bloom's taxonomy, Dale's learning cone, left brain, right brain, neuro-linguistic programming, social learning, and unlearning. These are to name but a few from Quinn's 2018 book entitled Millennials, Goldfish, and Other Training Misconceptions. In Colvin Clark's book, Evidence-Based Training Methods, and Nealon and Kirshner's book, Evidence-Informed Learning Design, the authors point to areas of encouragement, particularly around learning strategies, such as spaced or distributed practice, retrieval practice, interleaving or the variability of practice, questioning, and self-explanation. All these have been proven to be effective in improving learning. But it's not a case of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Good old direct instruction works, providing the implementation fits with the prior knowledge of the candidate, is placed within a relevant context, contains sufficient scaffolding to support the learning, and has been matched to a valid learning requirement. So, to what type of requirement are we applying this newfound best practice? Are we talking soft skills or hard skills, as Richard commented on? Or to put it another way, the behavioral fluffy stuff or the techie functional stuff? Or perhaps I could use more academic research-based identifiers, domain independent or domain specific requirements. Domain independent requirements concern attributes such as leadership, teamwork, communications, or problem solving. These have a line of origin back to McClelland in the USA some 50 years ago. Domain-specific requirements might center about job-related exercises and tasks, such as engine maintenance, CPR, or pouring a drink. These will have their origin as far back as the Middle Ages with the apprenticeship movement, came into more significant prominence in the early 20th century with Taylor's scientific method of management, and more recently in the UK with the work of Horton and vocational qualifications. Whilst training in these two distinct realms might be considered straightforward, utilising all the relevant developments in learning theory and practice, The effectiveness and validity of an intervention must always be tested in order to ensure meaning. Has learning taken place? Is a candidate more competent now than they were before they attended the session? Has a candidate met a prescribed standard? And it is the assessment of knowledge and skills and behaviours that challenges do appear. The question posed in this session is flight crew competence. What is being assessed and how? The what is a major challenge for us all, especially within learning and development. So acknowledging the title, what is competence? And as we dig deeper, what are the competencies? For a start, there isn't a single definition of the former, and there is an infinite number of the latter. Suzanne Cairns and her colleagues explore this in their 2016 book, Competency-based Education in Aviation, and echo some of the challenges found within the wider learning and development community. Do we assess domain-independent actions, behaviours and traits of a candidate, or the outcomes of an exercise or task? Or what is more likely, do we need to assess both at the same time? And if so, what impact will one have on the scoring of the other? Which feeds into the challenges of the how and the question posed, so as to ensure validity of any result. A chap called Duncan Jackson and others have published research into the confounding factors in assessment centres. In 2018 paper cites many effects that call into question the reliability of any results. A recent talk on dimensions-based behavioural indicators versus exercise and task-based assessment suggests that a behavioural score may be task dependent. For example, good leadership skills might be evident in one exercise, but not in another. Also, any rating may be about the ability or preference of the candidate to engage in a particular exercise or task than any dimension-related rating. If the confounding factors are not addressed within the conduct of an assessment of competencies, then the results of that assessment may be rendered meaningless. Aviation is fortunate in some respects in that the technical nature of the industry is based on the principles of scientific rigor. Someone ignorant of the science might have looked at the plans for an A380 and said, surely this aircraft could not get off the ground. It was intuitively implausible, but the science spoke and it did. The learning sciences, unfortunately, do not have such a rigorous foundation. That said, explorations are beginning to help support new evidence-informed theories and practices. As has been said, it is incumbent on all sectors to be open to change, particularly when the evidence says that what we put in place in the past, whilst laudable then, can no longer be supported by what we now know. In the learning and development sector, this is starting, sometimes begrudgingly, to happen. So the question I pose is, in the interest of flight crew competence, is the aviation sector following a similar path of acknowledging the development of learning sciences?
Fantastic presentation. Thank you very much, Peter. Very interesting, and I'm sure you've given a lot of the people listening some pause for thought and potentially quite a few references as well to go away and have a look at. That's fantastic. Thank you, Peter. So next up, we have Leah Fenimore-Hall, who is a behavioural scientist with extensive experience supporting organisations and individuals to encourage and engage in behaviours needed to meet their unique goals. She's a board certified behaviour analyst. She's also a director to the board of the UK Society for Behaviour Analysis and chair of the Organisational Behaviour Management Special Interest Group. That's a mouthful. So, Leah, over to you.
Very good. Are you able to see my screen? Or are you just seeing me? There we go. Right. Okay. There we go. So just before I give you the behavioral science critique of CBTA, let's start out with what are the benefits? So why did we adopt this approach? You know, it's about the changing that focus on quantity, right? Hours of flight to quality. It's about the potential for student-centered learning and the idea that students could possibly progress at different speeds. It's focused on outcomes as opposed to inputs. It allows us to standardize around the world. It's focused on the whole task instead of, again, just the number of hours you've been in the air. And it has the potential to support continuous improvement. But from a behavioral science perspective, I've picked just a few of my favorite issues from where we're sitting around competency-based training and assessment. So the first one is the way that most people establish competencies is with a consensus method. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it is as opposed to a science-based method. What that means is, as probably everyone here knows, the way that we've selected those competencies is by pulling together a group of experts and asking them, what does a good pilot do? The problem with that is what we know about humans, and experts in particular, is they're not very good at identifying what makes them good at their job. And in fact, the more expert you become, the worse you are at identifying what it is that you've got that somebody next to you who's less expert hasn't. So we do need to go back and determine if the competencies that we've selected are functioning exactly as we expected. So a pilot who makes a superior grade, is that pilot actually a superior pilot when it comes to their performance in the real world? And similarly, now that we're looking at standardizing instructors, do instructors who get those superior grades go on to train superior pilots? Hopefully so. Another great issue with standardization of anything is once you identify a minimum standard, what we know from behavioral science is everyone's behavior begins to gravitate towards that minimum standard. And that's fine. That's a wonderful thing when it comes to regulation. That's precisely what we're going for. And it's also really good for those who naturally came below that minimum standard. It's going to pull their behavior up to the minimum. What it doesn't do is address those who are capable of rising above that minimum standard, as I'm sure we'd all endeavor to do, because it hasn't provided a really clear explanation or instruction or motivation around what does that look like. So we haven't illuminated what superior performance looks like. The third one is, in order for this to work, we have to manage people on a daily basis. So it's not, performance management is not just assessment and training. It's what happens every single day when we go out and fly or when we go and instruct. And what we know, similar to Peter's earlier points, is popular leadership advice and common sense almost never overlap with science. So, you know, what do you do when people aren't doing what you expect them to do? We need to make sure that instructors understand how people learn and how to manage performance. So what does that look like? What could we do so that we're getting closer to this superior performance life cycle you see in front of you? I would say there's two major changes that we could make right away that would be in line with behavioral science. The first one is taking advantage of this opportunity that we have to shift our focus from the floor, from the minimum, the ceiling, to what is possible. Right now, we classify superior performance based on outcomes on safety, as well we should. But if we can understand how that outcome is achieved, so which competencies do we most commonly associate with superior performance, what that allows us to do is to allow our performers to aspire to that, right? Because now we've made it clear. And it allows our instructors not only to teach it, but more importantly, when they see it, they're able to call it out and they know what to call it. The second thing that we can do is really work on this performance management piece. And if you're feeling skeptical, I would just direct you to a statement that actually comes from Maritime, which is organizations create the behavior they get, and they get the behavior they deserve. It's a hard bit of information to take on, but the reality is your organizational systems, the way that we instruct, the way that we manage, the way that we grade, that will result in the performance that you see. So it's quite a gamble to not back the way we do that with science, especially when the science that's available is really straightforward. It's really simple, and it doesn't require any jargon. It stands the test of time. You know, we've been saying the same things for about 100 years in behavioral science. So if we can provide some guidelines explaining the best way to manage on a daily basis, the best way to reinforce those lessons learned in training and to sort of ensure organizations are getting the behavior that they expect, that really helps to sort of wrap up this whole process. And what you'll notice is, you know, this is the cycle for a reason. So I think, you know, it might be confusing to see selection there in the middle, but actually, if we're getting really good hard data on what makes a good performer, and we use that to design our framework, that should be informing selection. And that might look different for pilots than it looks for instructors. So as we mentioned earlier, if you're going to select a pilot, yes, it's critically important they have good technical skills. Yes, it's critically important they have good non-technical skills. But what about an instructor? Right now, I think we're probably selecting on those same criteria, despite the fact that they have a vastly different job. So if we're able to use this good information on what makes a superior instructor, that should allow us to select quite differently. And imagine what that could do for the results of those instructors, you know, the competency of the students. So making those couple of changes, focusing on performance management and focusing on the data, especially around superior performance, it allows us to constantly refresh our understanding of competent and superior performance, because that does change over time. I'm sure I don't have to tell anyone in the audience that what we deem to be a good pilot now, it looks quite a bit different than it did probably 50 years ago. And in 50 years, it might look different again. What's required of pilots and instructors might look different in the future. So if we're always paying attention to that data, then we're constantly able to refresh our understanding. It makes it easier to encourage and teach superior performance. Again, if we know what it looks like, we can teach it, we can aspire to it. It also allows us to get the best out of people every day through our active performance management. So it gives us the ability to remove that air of mystery around, you know, the people that I manage. Why do they do what they do? How can I get them to change? How can I motivate them better? You know, instead of jargon, if we just give some really simple guidelines. And finally, all of that allows us, again, to inform selection. So two very small changes and hopefully very big outcomes for the industry. That's all from me.
Thank you very much, Leah. Great presentation, and again, very insightful, and I'm sure we'll encourage a few questions from our audience there. Thank you very much. So next up, and lastly, our last presenter of the day is Dr. Suzanne Cairns, who's an associate professor at the University of Waterloo. She's an internationally recognised leader in aviation education research, and airplane and helicopter pilot licenses at the age of 17. And over the last 16 years, she has taught and mentored thousands of aviation students and written, co-authored 6 books, including Competency-based education in aviation. Over to you, Suzanne.
Thank you. I'll just see if I can get my slides. All right, hopefully you're able to see my slides now. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be included. I loved listening to the fellow panelists. It's wonderful to see the integration of these science and evidence-based approaches flowing into competency-based training. And I have a little bit of a different perspective, but hopefully it adds to the conversation and is of interest to the audience. So I think before we begin, it's really important to sort of acknowledge where we are today, that if we look back last year, so January of last year, I think that before the pandemic, I know it feels like a lifetime ago, it's hard almost to put ourselves in that mindset. But what I would suggest is that our industry was facing 3 very significant challenges. We had the growing focus on environmental sustainability with the flight shaming movement really having sort of a significant focus of our attention. We had a growing shortage of personnel. So across the entire world, by some accounts, the entire global training capacity to produce aviators would not be sufficient to meet the demand based on the growth that was expected. We also had the rapid evolution of technology, and a challenge, with a very regulated and demand-intensive industry like ours is that when this technology evolves, it really does shift the competencies and the requirements in order to use it. So these are sort of big things that were on our plate. Now, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic has disrupted every aspect of aviation on a global scale. I think the collective pain and difficulty that have been faced by all of our colleagues is fairly universal. And I think the first priority for our sector needs to be supporting our operators through the pandemic so we all have an industry to return to once things hopefully get better. And I think the vaccine news is good news. So hopefully that's something we can look forward to in the future. But I think that understanding that if the top priority is focusing on operators, it does create an opportunity for the rest of us to really challenge and think about a variety of issues that we may have taken for granted before the pandemic. That it's not the time to pause innovation. It really does present an opportunity to challenge the status quo, to ask hard questions, and to think about how we can support the sector so that when we go through this post-pandemic recovery, that they're in the best position possible. And I really like to frame it around the concept of sustainability. And because we're talking about competency-based training, it's really about the sustainability of the workforce and really looking at the people who we rely on to make this industry work and how we are supporting them in the best way possible. And I know some of my presenters, of course, they've done a wonderful job laying the foundation, and I wasn't sure how much background was needed. So I have just a few slides for those on the call who may have never heard of competency-based training before or know what it is. And I think the foundation that's important to understand is that, of course, the history of pilot licensing was based on an hours model. You need a certain number of hours doing classroom-based work, and you need a certain number of hours in an aircraft. And then when you meet licensing standard, then you can get that license, but you need those hours in order to do it. But one of the challenges with a system based on hours is that there's no benefit for doing things better. So if we have new technologies or methods or practices that allow a person to develop their skills more quickly, there's no way to recognize that by giving them a license more quickly. So if you look back to before the pandemic, where we had this looming shortage of professionals, the reality is that you can't expedite a system by innovating if that system's based on time. It's still based on hours, so there's no way to do things better or to really recognize that. And as somebody who loves aviation and who grew up in the system, I had so much respect for the regulations. And in the course of my research, I had an interview with a regulator on international level. And I said, why hours? Like, why did we start in that way? What was the goal of using hours? And he had said, think about it this way. If you work for an international regulator and there's a safety concern that's come across your desk, he said, the easiest way to show evidence that you've addressed that issue is to throw a few hours of training at that problem, because it demonstrates that you've taken some action, you've addressed it, you've sort of mandated that something change. But he said, even you probably in the back of your head know that that doesn't make that problem go away. And that piece was such a nugget for me that changed my way of thinking, to say that there's nothing inherently powerful about hours, right? There's nothing magical. We all have hours that change our life, and we have hours where we're completely distracted and bored and maybe on our phones. So it's not the hours that matter, it's what happens during that time that matters. And I think that shift is sort of the fundamental underlying of what competency-based training is. The other thing I suggest is that a competent performer is somebody who's able to do a job by themselves without someone looking over their shoulder or correcting them. But what I like to suggest is that it's sort of like getting to the top of a mountain, that if a competent performer has reached the top of their mountain, then an hours-based approach is sort of like these switchbacks that go back and forth and weave their way up the mountain. That there are some really important moments that cause you to think and develop your skills, and that's sort of when you switch back and you go a little bit higher up. But there's a lot of hours where you're probably just kind of doing the same thing you've done 100 times that is not necessarily developing you as a competent professional. It's kind of routine. And so what a competency-based approach sort of at its essence is trying to do is saying, what if we extract all of those key elements that were most impactful for that person? And instead of just putting them in the world and naturalistically hoping that they encounter them on their own, what if we line them up and in essence creating a chairlift to the top of the mountain? That the end goal is still sort of the same, but the way that we get there can really optimize that learner's development. The other thing I think is really important, there's a lot of definitions of competence, competency-based training. The one that we developed in the book, I'm going to just briefly explain because I think it's helpful, at least for me, it was tremendously helpful to understand it. So if you think about actual competence, any of you who are experts or who are functional in a job role are competent in that job. So the word competence is what you do as a professional. And that's something that develops over time, and there's knowledge, skills, and attitudes, and a lot of complexities built into it. Competencies are different. Competencies are written descriptions of what you do. And as Leah mentioned, usually we use a consensus model where we get a variety of experts sitting around a table and they write out these written descriptions. But inherent in that process is a gap, right? If I asked each of you to take a piece of paper and write down all of the knowledge, skills, and attitudes that you need to be competent in your job, you can start to understand there would be, probably as soon as your pen hit the paper, you'd start to oversimplify what's actually involved. And it's very difficult for us to be aware of our actual competence. So understanding there's a gap there between true competence and these descriptions we create. And then competency-based education is an entire educational framework that references these competency statements as an indication for when a learner can progress through training. And as well, when it's implemented in training, there's a gap. So there's a gap between competency-based education and those competencies. And I think from my framework, that was very helpful in understanding that competency-based training isn't a perfect solution to every training problem, but it is something that can help us move a little bit more in the right direction and build upon the strength and the success and the capabilities of our existing training system, which of course is very robust and does a great job around the world. So there's some advantages and limitations. Leah outlined a lot of these as well, so I'm not going to go through them all. But as you can understand, when we use a consensus model, there is bias mixed in to the development of competencies. They're written by people, and of course, anybody who study human factors know that people tend to make mistakes or we're influenced in different ways. One of the key things I think is important is the underlined section, which is that people often say, yeah, that it does allow people to progress at their own pace. But if I was a training manager and I had two pilots and one took 100 hours to learn something and someone else took an hour, I just don't have the resources to put 100 hours into everyone. And that's a very valid point. And so what I like to suggest is important to understand is that in a competency-based training framework, training time is a resource. It's a valuable and important resource that you have, but it's not the organizing framework for instruction, and that's quite different. And also the end goal of competency-based training is, again, trying to get someone to be a competent professional who can do that job without someone looking over their shoulder. And yes, we don't want to target only the minimum standards. We do want each individual to reach their capacity, but that's the goal, is that they can do a job autonomously. But it's not the same as expertise. So with expertise comes this almost like magical ability to like think incredibly fast and to hold a massive amount of information in your head. If you've ever had an expert instructor and been mesmerized, like, how are you paying attention to all of those things? That's such an amazing indication of expertise. But we don't want to teach to expertise in training, because they'd be in training for years longer than they need to. So we can't expect somebody who graduates training who's competent to be an expert. There's quite a gap there that is filled through professional experience. So linking this back to sustainability, imagine two scenarios. So if you think Abe here on the slide is a former student of mine, and if you think about if Abe were to go through a traditional hours-based approach, that there is this expectation that the student needs to fit into the curriculum. So they need to learn in the way they're being taught, but it is very much led by the instructor. If you are a high performer, sometimes you might feel bored, or you might feel like you're not interested. And if you're a low performer, you might feel left behind. There is a higher cost because all of the training happens in an aircraft, so it's a bit more expensive. And if you've already mastered something, or you're already competent in a skill, it doesn't matter that you are competent, because you may still need several more hours in order to meet licensing criteria. So there's a higher cost. And because you're in an aircraft burning fuel, you're producing higher engine and noise emissions. But if you look at a competency-based approach in ab initio training, it's learner-centric, so it really is more supportive of the individual. There's some adaptability to support individual differences, and I think that's really important, because we don't want to only think of people in terms of their sameness and conformity. High performers are able to skip ahead once they've established competency, and low performers can get extra support. They can find, like, I'm individually weak in this area, so let me focus my time specifically on that. Training costs can be reduced because we can have a higher integration of simulators and other devices, lowering those costs for people, as well as reducing engine and noise emissions when we're using these training technologies. So these really do link through to the three key pillars that were those big challenges from the beginning of the presentation, that we're supporting social sustainability of our workforce. We are really thinking about the education process in each learner and thinking about how we support them in the best way possible. Asking hard questions like, is there some bias that's mixed into the way we train and assess, and really creating an opportunity and space for everyone to succeed. We're being considerate of environmental sustainability by, when it makes sense and when it's justified by the evidence, shifting some of that flight training into devices that aren't producing emissions. And there's economical sustainability, because for most flight schools, they have a higher return on investment financially for an hour in the simulator than an hour in the aircraft. So there are widespread advantages. So again, we can't solve the challenges of the future by relying on the past. And I think if there's one theme that's consistent through all of the wonderful panelists that have spoken before me, is the need for evidence and the need for science to lead where we're going next. And that's something that I've been living in for the past year or so, as I've been understanding the pain that the aviation industry has been going through, and thinking that I'm embedded in a very research-intensive university in Canada, and looking around campus and seeing world-leading experts in all of these fields that aren't previously applied to aviation, and thinking, what if they were? like what if we had access to world-leading computer scientists and the artificial intelligence and quantum and physiology and everything in between? And so what I've been doing is working to establish and build a research institute at the university called the Waterloo Institute for Sustainable Aeronautics. But with those three key pillars of sustainability, and with a deliberate and important focus on the personnel, that social sustainability of our workforce, that how we can sort of cross-sector reach out and across different research disciplines reach out and bring that together to serve our industry and support pandemic recovery. So I don't think any of us can do it alone. I think it's only through collaboration, and I would hope that over time perhaps we could have an international network of similar types of institutes where, you know, when the industry has problems, they know where to go to collaborate and partner with researchers to help them address those. So that's my presentation. Thank you so much for the opportunity today, and I look forward to the questions and answers.
Thank you, Suzanne. Fantastic presentation. We have time, we've got around 10 minutes to take some questions. So we've had some great questions coming through from the audience, and which is clearly a reflection of the standard of the quality of the presentations. So let me run through these. The first one's from Stephen. So where does risk management and mitigation fit into the equation? I've had a number of students and candidates who were great stick and rudder pilots, but judgment and risk management was always in question. How does that affect CBT and evaluation? It's a very good question. Would anyone like to, that's not to a specific person, would anyone like to volunteer to answer that one? Okay, Suzanne.
So specifically in risk management, I think this highlights the idea that the history of aviation training, and my expertise is on the ab initio side, but we tend to have training that's kind of canned, right? Like the best way I think to explain it is if you look at a student pilot, that they'll learn meteorology and then they'll stop and they'll learn air law, and then they'll stop and then they'll learn like general airmanship. But if you ask any pilot, do you fly thinking only of meteorology exclusively and then shift and think of air law exclusively? That the reality is the more segregated you teach content, the longer it takes for learners to put those pieces back together and to apply it operationally. So when you talk about risk management, like these are actual real threats and challenges that people are facing in the real world. And I think it's a very valid question, which is, does our training process teach people to handle real scenarios and real problems, or is it sort of more of this artificial capacity? And I think competency-based training does allow us the opportunity to sort of shift into more of this whole task training, and that's part of the goal.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you, Stephen, for that question. The next question is from Oliver. What are your thoughts on the MPL versus the traditional ATPL training routes, especially with regard to a lack of stick and rudder skills and a greater emphasis on flight management skills? Again, this question isn't directed at an individual person. Richard, would you like to comment on that one?
Yeah, what I'd say is, because the MPL is based around the competencies, as Suzanne and Leah both pointed out, the competencies are what we want to see people develop as time goes on. So I'd say those competencies are what lead to professionals to be able to be good at their job. And therefore, if those competencies are followed as part and parcel of a training program, you get the outcome you desire. I think coming back to Suzanne's bit is stick and rudder skills based on experience are not necessarily always what they boil down to, because you can have 20,000 hours, but you may not be a particularly good stick and rudder person. So it's around the capability of being able to understand, as an individual builds that experience, how will that fit into the particular program, particularly MPL? And that is where I would come from, to say, look, the competencies are all laid down there. The stick and rudder skills are part of those competencies and being built into that program. And as a result of that, I don't see the MPL being any different to the ATPL program. In fact, I think some of the benefits of the MPL are demonstrated when you see the guys come out the other end of the training program.
Okay, thank you, Richard. The next question is from Kerry, and it's directed to Leah. So, Leah, thank you for a thoughtful presentation. Could you give an example of how you could determine what the correct competencies are using a scientific method rather than a consensual approach?
Right. So unfortunately, what you're stuck looking at is the after the fact measure. So if we've said competencies are 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, if you as an individual have been graded competent in all of those areas, are you going on to display competence in the real world? So it's about that match. another way of looking at it is for those individuals who we recognize as being particularly competent, particularly good towards expert performers, what are they doing? And how does that stack up against people that are gravitating towards the minimum and people that are falling below it? So if you're paying attention to the behavior, right, to what do people do at those various levels of expertise, that should start to show you whether you've hit the mark or not.
Mm. Yes, Suzanne.
I just want to add to that we're looking at exploring ways that technology can help guide some of that process as well. So there's the consensus model, but there's also like a cognitive task analysis where like a researcher is looking at you and sort of trying to guess at everything you're doing, but it's limited because you can't see inside a person's brain to know exactly what they're thinking. You don't know if they sort of happened to get something right or if they were actually thinking ahead and they knew what they were doing. So we're looking at sort of mobilizing artificial intelligence and machine learning informed by biometrics, which is a lot of big words, but it's basically like put somebody in a simulator, hook them up to their heart rate, put an eye tracker on looking at pupil dilation and gaze behavior, and then put them into a flight scenario. And if we think about how many hours they have, what you build up over time is you can build up this sort of model of a person's development, and sort of the holy grail, not to be religious, but the outcome would be if we could get to a point where a student could go and sit in a simulator and conduct an exercise, then the simulator through this machine learning and artificial intelligence algorithm could actually tell you what your performance is and where your weaknesses are, and then you can start having sort of this not subjective measure, but really objective measure of what competence is. So I think we'll get there over time, but it's a lot of work, right? And you can see that there's a big gap between, all of this data-informed idea of what competence is and the consensus model, which is where we've started from. So hopefully over time we can find that, marry those two things together to bring in that industry expertise and match it with the evidence.
Thank you very much. I hope that answers that question quite thoroughly. We've got time for perhaps one or two more before we close. So unfortunately, I'm not going to get around to all the questions that have come in, but I'm sure after this, if you want to engage with any of the speakers, I'm sure they'll be more than happy to hear from you with any follow-up questions independently. So there's a question here for Peter Mays. What place does formative and summative assessment play in building a competency picture over time for pilots? That question's from you.
Yeah, love the two words, formative and summative. Where I come from the learning and development side of things, formative assessment is implicit within everything that one is doing within learning and development, and the learning development that I do, and is written into any of the programs that one does. The summative assessment, yeah, that's the test at the end that might be a competency-based test that, as is being seen in secondary education, people struggle with. And is somebody failing a summative test actually a bad pilot? So it is a challenge because they may have been adversely affected within that assessment methodology. How one reconciles that, don't know. It's going to be an ongoing process and a developmental process as science informs, because the science now, or 50 years ago or 20 years ago, is different to the science now and the science that is going to be in the future, and it has to inform it all the time. And as I said, all sectors have to keep an eye on that with regards to how they do assessments.
Lovely, thank you very much, Peter. So there's one final question, hopefully we'll get this in before time, and this is an open floor one. In trying to solve one training problem by establishing EBT techniques in the industry, are we creating another through the complexity and extent of the knowledge demanded of the instructor, cadre, to be able to train these methods effectively? Fantastic question.
Do you want me to? Having done this now for a while, I would say yes, we do run the risk of overcomplicating, because the skill sets that are needed to be able to do the root cause analysis, particularly of attitudes, is not something that's been taught to pilots over the years, and particularly instructor pilots. And because that's a much more complex psychological discussion rather than the simple technical yes, no, and psychomotor skills of flying left, right to prescribed set of numbers. So there is a whole training demand piece that's required with the rest of those competencies, in my opinion.
Okay, that's fantastic. Well, we've gone slightly over, and I think that's probably to the extent that we're allowed to today, but thank you so much to all of our speakers for some really fascinating presentations, and thank you everybody who's joined us and taken part and sent those questions through. Really, really good questions for all of the speakers. So with that, we will close. Enjoy the rest of your day and stay safe, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.